Now at this point, you know what the web is and how it works and which key technologies are involved. I now briefly want to come back to this URL thing here, the address which you enter in the browser, and have a look at a couple of other technical details of how the web works. And then after that, we're going to learn how you can get the most out of the course before we then dive right into the code and you'll learn how to build websites step by step. So let's take another look at this URL thing now, because there are a couple of terms you must be aware of. For example, we have this part at the beginning here. You don't enter this on your own very often. Instead, it's added automatically by browsers. This defines the so-called protocol that's used for talking to the remote computer, to the server. And here, HTTP or HTTPS is the standard. And as a web developer, you don't need to worry too much about this because it is basically handled for you. Still, that's this part. Then we have this thing in the middle. This is the so-called domain. It's the human readable address, the identifier of a website. A human readable because domains like apple.com, amazon.com, and so on, of course, are pretty straightforward to memorize. And I'll come back to this domain in a couple of seconds, but this is also part of every URL that you enter. Now here on this example slide, the last part, however, is not part of every URL. This is a so-called path, and you will often see this in URLs as well. Paths act as pointers to specific resources, specific pages on a website. For example, if you visit Academine.com, which is our website, if you just enter Academine.com, you end up on the starting page. But if you then go to one of our sub-pages, like the tutorials page, you see that the address changed. It's now academine.com/tutorials. And URLs support paths because you can now grab the entire URL that includes the path, and you could share this with anyone in the world. And if another person enters this same URL in their browser, they are directed to the same page on the website, instead of always ending up on the starting page. That's why this is another important feature of the web and of URLs. You can point at specific resources on a website. And of course, in this course, we're also going to build websites that consist of multiple pages. So that's the URL. Now, I want to come back to this big picture of how the web works, because here we now also can dig a little bit deeper to understand better what exactly happens under the hood when you enter an address like academine.com or amazon.com or any other address. You enter this address, and we learned that this is called a domain here if you just have something like academine.com. And this then in the end leads to the browser sending a request to some server, which then sends back a response with the website code. Now what actually happens is a slightly different thing though. This request is sent, but it's actually not sent with just this domain. Instead, all the devices that take part in the internet, so to say, have so-called IP addresses. IP stands for Internet Protocol, and it's another standard that controls how devices in the internet are identified. Now, IP addresses look something like this, and therefore, of course, they are pretty hard to memorize for humans. But every device in the internet, including your computer, has such an IP address. And these IP addresses are actually needed for establishing connections and talking to each other. Now, since they are hard to memorize, we have these domains though, which are easier to memorize for humans, but which are not used by default to establishing these connections and sending requests. And the reason for this is that all devices that are part of the internet need such a unique identifier. But of course, for example, your computer, if it's not hosting a website, which it typically isn't, doesn't have a human readable domain. That's why we don't use domains for establishing connections, because every device has an IP address, but not every device has a domain. However, as a user, as a visitor of a website, we of course want to enter such a domain to view the website, not the IP address. Though if you knew the IP address of a specific website, you could enter this as well. But of course, typically we don't know that. That's why, as part of the internet, we have some special servers which are operated by global organizations, the so-called DNS servers. DNS stands for Domain Name System, and these are servers that contain mapping tables, you could say. Long tables with all the known domains and the IP addresses that belong to these domains. So the IP addresses of the remote computers that host the websites that belong to certain domains. And when you enter an address like Amazon.com in the browser, or Academite.com or anything else, your browser actually first talks to such a DNS server to translate the domain into an IP address. And then once that IP address was returned, then your browser sends the actual request to this remote machine, to this server serving a website, which is now identified with help of that IP address. That's what actually happens here. And even though that might sound like a long-taking process, this is actually all super quick and only takes a couple of milliseconds. But that's what's going on behind the scenes. And that's also the reason why, when you want to publish a website, you typically have to buy such a domain first, at least if you want to have a custom domain. Because these domains have to be registered globally, you can't just come up with one, because of course they must only be used once, they have to be unique, and therefore you wouldn't be able to, for example, register Amazon.com if you wanted to do that, because that domain is already taken by the Amazon company. But you can take other domains, and once you bought them, they are registered and they are added to these mapping tables, so to say. And that's also important to understand and to be aware of. We have these IP addresses which are actually used and domains which are translated to these IP addresses. Now, as a last note, I did of course say that every device in the internet has such an IP address, but you don't need to worry that this means that other people could start connecting to your computer. This by default is not possible because you can still control whether a device is allowing incoming traffic or not, and by default your computer does not allow incoming traffic. These servers, which are serving websites, are configured to allow incoming traffic. Your computer typically is not. So it has this IP, but it still isn't reachable by everyone in the World Wide Web. And with that, we now had enough theory for the moment. That's it for the moment. Let's now see how you can get the most out of this course and how you can take this course before we then thereafter dive into the actual code you can write and learn more about web development step by step from the ground up.